Elsie let go of my hand. I had told her to hold on. I had told her that morning in the cider house at the edge of the orchard that we were only going to watch through the trees, that we would be quiet, that no one would see us, the way no one ever saw us. She was 2.5. She did not know the word wedding. She only knew that down the long gravel aisle, between the apple trees dropping their white blossom on 200 strangers, there was a woman in Rennard green standing very still at the altar, and that the woman had her eyes. My daughter had her eyes, and before I could close my hand again, she stepped out of the trees onto the gravel and began, in her wobbling, determined way, to walk toward her. 200 faces turned. The woman at the altar turned last. She went still the way she always went still, 2 fingers to the old scar on her wrist, and then she said the 2 words I had waited 3 years to stop hearing in my sleep. She said, "Not without you."
If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so the next one can find you. Stay close.
If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up. My name is Saskia Merrin, and for 6 years I have been the linen keeper of Orchard Hall, the great apple orchard estate house Aldemar has kept in this valley since before anyone living can remember. It is a small, particular life. I mend and press and stitch. I keep the still room and the long cupboards of cream linen that smell of lavender and cold water. I know every sheet in the house by its weave. I am careful. I have always been careful. My mother, who kept the linen before me, taught me to count my stitches when my hands began to shake, because a counted stitch is a straight one, and because counting is a thing you can do when there is nothing else to be done. I still count. I have counted through worse than shaking hands. I touched, without meaning to, the small pearwood needle case she left me, the one I wear at my throat, and I made myself begin at the beginning. Odile Rennard came to Orchard Hall the first time when I was 23. She was 34 then, the heir of House Rennard, which meant orchards and shipping and half the barges on the river. And she came to talk trade with the Aldemars about grafting stock and cider contracts, and she was meant to stay 4 days. She stayed 3 weeks. I remember thinking the first time I saw her cross the courtyard that she moved like someone who had never once had to hurry. A low, unhurried economy of movement, a stillness that made the rest of us look like startled birds. She had dark chestnut hair pulled back off a pale face, and a thin old scar through one eyebrow, and eyes of a green so deep and so rare that I stopped on the stair to look at them, which I never did, because I was careful, and careful people do not stop on stairs to look at anyone. She found me in the still room on the second day, looking for somewhere quiet, and she stayed because I did not talk. That was the whole of it. At the beginning, I was pressing a christening gown for one of the Aldemar cousins, a small thing, all whitework and tiny pleats, and she sat on the stool by the cold window and watched my hands and did not once try to fill the silence. And when I finally spoke, it was only to ask her to move her elbow off the good linen. She moved her elbow. Then she said, "You count." I said, "What?" She said, "Under your breath. When the pleats are close, you count." I had not known that anyone could see it. I had spent my whole life making sure no one could see it. I said nothing, and pressed the next pleat, and counted. And she watched me count, and neither of us said the thing that had just happened. There was a pear tree at the far end of the espalier walk, the old kind, trained flat against the south wall, its branches pinned out like a diagram of a thing that had learned to want the sun. She liked it. She said her house had kept orchards for 100 years, and she had never once been allowed to simply stand in one, and so we stood in one. We stood in that one a great many times over 3 weeks, and then over the 2 years after, whenever she could make the river bring her back. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist when she was deciding whether to say a true thing. I learned that early, the wrist, the little tell, and one evening under the flat pear tree, she pressed her wrist and decided and said the true thing. And I will not tell you yet what it was, because it belongs later. What I will tell you is that she gave me a ring. Not the way you are thinking. It was a plain iron band, ugly, honestly, a working ring. The kind the barge masters of her house wear because gold catches on rope, and iron does not. She took it off her own hand and put it in mine and closed my fingers over it, and said it was not a promise, because promises were only things people said, and she did not want to say a thing. She wanted to hand me a thing, so that on the days she could not be in the valley, I would have something with a weight to it. I kept it on the cord at my throat, next to my mother's needle case, iron and pear wood. I used to hold them both at once without noticing I was doing it. I want you to remember the iron ring. It matters later how this ends. I was happy. I am telling you that, plainly because it will not last the hour, and I want it on the record that it was real. For a little while, a careful linen keeper and the heir of a shipping house stood under a flat pear tree and were, against every sensible thing, happy. Mrs. Enderby, our housekeeper, who has kept Orchard Hall for 40 years and misses nothing, watched it happen and said only one thing to me. Once, folding sheets at my side, she said, "Be careful with that one, not because she is not good, but because her house is not hers." I did not understand what she meant. I understood it later, completely, the way you understand a step you have already fallen down. Her house was not hers. That was the whole shape of everything that came after. The man who owned her house, in every way that mattered, was her uncle, Lord Corwin Rennard. He had raised her after her parents' barge went down in the spring floods when she was 9, and he had raised her the way you espalier a pear tree, pinning every branch to the wall he had chosen, so she would grow flat and useful and pointed at the sun he wanted. He was never once unkind to her that I saw, and that was the terrible part. He was courteous. He had iron buttons on a forest green coat and a voice like a drawer sliding shut, and he had decided, long before he ever heard my name, exactly whom Odile would marry and exactly what the shipping alliance would be worth. And a linen keeper in a valley was not a variable in that sum. He simply removed me. I want to tell you how because the how is the whole wound. He came to me himself. That was almost a courtesy, I understood later. He did not send a steward. He came to the still room on a gray morning while Odile was down at the river seeing to the barges, and he stood in the doorway with the light behind him so I could not see his face. And he told me, in that closing drawer voice, that he knew. He knew everything. He said he did not blame me. A girl of my situation. An alpha of Odile's standing, of course. He said it the way you say, of course, rain is wet. And then he told me what would happen to Orchard Hall's contracts, and to my mother's cousins 2 valleys over who leased Rennard land if I did not end it cleanly, myself, that week, and let Odile believe I had chosen to go. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. I used to think that was where she had learned it. I want to tell you I refused. I have wanted to tell you that for 3 years, but I had counted the way I count, and the sum did not come out in my favor. If I stayed and fought him, he would ruin the Aldemar's cider trade and turn my mother's cousins off their fields, and he would still, in the end, take Odile north and marry her where I could not reach, because her house was not hers and mine was a cupboard of linen. If I went and let her think I had gone freely, then at least the Aldemars kept their contracts, and my mother's people kept their land, and Odile kept the one thing I could still give her, which was a clean wound instead of a long war she would lose. So I did the arithmetic of it, and the arithmetic said leave and lie, and let her hate you. I closed the little christening gown I was hemming that morning into its drawer. I did not finish it. I want you to remember that I left it unfinished. He gave me the words to say, and a purse of silver to be seen taking, because a lie needs a prop, and mine was to be greed. I met her under the flat pear tree, because I could not bear to do it anywhere else, which was its own small cruelty. I told her I was tired of a valley and a linen cupboard, and of waiting for a barge that only came when a great house could spare it. I told her I had been offered a place in a city house and had taken it and taken something to go with it. I made my face flat. I had learned flatness from her, and I turned it on her, and it worked. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, deciding whether to believe a true thing. And I watched her decide to believe the false one, because I had built it too well. She did not argue. She said one word. She said my name, just Saskia. And then she went still, and turned, and walked back down the espalier walk and did not look back. And I let her not look back. I kept the ring. That was the one instruction I disobeyed. I was to give it back. A clean break returns the token, and I stood there with it in my closed fist and told him it had gone in the river. And he looked at me a long moment and decided a lost ring was not worth a second conversation. So I have it still, iron and pear wood, at my throat for 3 years. I have taken it off exactly once, and I will tell you when. The silver I gave to my mother's cousins, every coin of it, because it was theirs really, the price of their fields staying theirs, and I never spent a piece on myself, which mattered to no one but me, but it mattered to me, so I am telling you, I did not go to a city house. There was no city house, that was part of the prop. I went to my mother's cousins for the winter, 2 valleys over, and I mended their linen and pressed their neighbors' Sunday shirts and counted stitches in a cold room, and I thought I was simply going to be sad for the rest of my life in the ordinary way that people are. And then, in the 2nd month, I was sick in the mornings, and the older cousin, who had raised 6 of her own, looked at me across the washtub one gray dawn and did not say anything unkind. She said, "How far along?" in the voice you use for weather. And I sat down on the edge of the tub, and I counted. I actually counted the weeks on my fingers, like stitches, and the sum came out. And I understood that Lord Corwin Rennard had removed me from his arithmetic 1 variable too soon. I could have gone back. I want to be honest that the thought stood in the room with me for a whole night. I could have walked into that great hall with my hand on my belly and undone every lie in an afternoon. And I lay awake and did the arithmetic again, the way I always do. And it came out worse than before, because a linen keeper with a rumor is a scandal. But a linen keeper carrying the Rennard heir's blood is a threat to a shipping alliance worth more than my whole valley. And Corwin Rennard did not leave threats loose. He would have taken the child for the house and pinned her to his wall the way he pinned Odile. Or he would have called her base-born and made certain no door in the north ever opened to her. Either way, she would not be free, and she would not be mine. So I did the hardest sum of my life, and I chose to vanish well enough that no one would come counting. I chose to keep her small and hidden and free. Her name is Elsie. She was born in the spring, in the cold back room of my cousin's house, with the older cousin's hands to catch her, and the younger one boiling water that no one needed. And she came out furious and loud, which I have never once minded because loud is the opposite of hidden. And she is allowed to be loud with me. They put her on my chest, and I looked down to count her fingers, 10, and her toes, 10, and then she opened her eyes. I want to tell you what it is to be a woman who has given up the person she loves in order to keep them safe, and then to look down into the face of a 2-day-old child and see, looking back, that exact impossible green, deep and rare, her eyes. I did not count anything for a long time after that. There was nothing left to make straight. I just held her and let my hands shake and did not stop them. When Elsie was a year old, the Aldemars sent for me. Their new linen keeper had married and gone, and old Mrs. Enderby, who misses nothing, had let it be known that if Saskia Merrin ever wished to come back, her still room stood empty. I should have said no. 2 valleys was a safe distance, and Orchard Hall was Rennard adjacent in 100 small ways, barges and contracts and Corwin's long reach. But my cousin's house was small and its walls were thin, and a growing loud child needs more sky than a cold back room, and there is a cider house cottage at the very edge of the Orchard Hall land, half fallen, that no one had used in years. I asked for it instead of a room in the house. Mrs. Enderby looked at me a moment, the way she looks, and did not ask why a linen keeper wanted a whole cottage at the far dark edge of the orchard. She gave me the key. She has always given me the key, and not the question. I have never deserved her. So this is the life you must picture. for the 2 years before the blossom and the isle. In the day, I am the linen keeper of Orchard Hall, careful and quiet, pressing pleats and counting stitches, known by everyone and truly known by no one. And at the far edge of the orchard, in a mended cider house with whitewash I did myself, and a heart that draws if you know its temper, there is a loud, green-eyed girl who believes the whole world is one cottage and one mother, and a very great many apple trees. She does not know her other mother's house owns the barges on the river. She does not know the word Rennard. She tugs her own earlobe when she is shy, a small particular thing, thumb and finger to the ear, that I did not teach her, and that I have seen before, exactly once, years ago, on the heir of a shipping house who thought no one was watching her be nervous. She has her eyes. She has that too. I catalog my daughter the way I once cataloged the woman I lost, and every entry is the same entry, twice. Elsie's favorite place in the world is the flat pear tree at the end of the espalier walk. I did not choose it for her. She chose it herself, the first spring she could walk, toddling straight down the grass to the one tree in a whole orchard that is pinned open like a hand. And she stood under it and laughed, and I stood behind her and could not breathe. Because I had stood under that tree and been happy once, with a woman who pressed her wrist before she told the truth, and now here was a small, loud copy of that woman's eyes, laughing under the same branches, and neither of them would ever know about the other, if I did my work well. I bring Elsie to the pear tree most evenings after that. I tell myself it is because the grass is soft there. It is not because the grass is soft there. I am a careful woman, and I know exactly why I do the things I do, even the ones I pretend not to. There is a christening gown I have never been able to finish. Not the Aldemar cousins, mine, Elsie's. I began it the winter I was carrying her, in the cold room 2 valleys over, white work and tiny pleats, the same pattern I had pressed the morning Corwin came to the still room, because my hands only know the one pattern, and grief makes you reach for what your hands already know. It lives in a drawer in the cider house, wrapped in blue paper. It is finished, but for the last seam at the shoulder, and I cannot close that seam. I have tried. I sit down with it in the evenings when Elsie is asleep, and I thread the needle, and I lift the cloth, and my hands begin to shake, and I count, and the counting does not work, which it has never once failed to do. Except with this. A christening is a thing you do in a chapel, in front of people, with a name said aloud. My daughter cannot have that. So the gown stays open at the shoulder, and I stay a woman who cannot finish one seam. The news came in the spring, on an ordinary Tuesday from Perry, one of the orchard hands, 19 and kind and constitutionally unable to hold a piece of news for more than the length of the yard. He came pelting up to the still-room window, cap in hand, to tell me the great thing, the enormous thing. Orchard Hall had been chosen to host a wedding, a grand one. House Rennard was marrying into House Voss, a shipping alliance. The barges in the coast road joined at last, and the old lord wanted it done somewhere neutral and beautiful. And what was more neutral and beautiful than the Aldemar's blossom in May? Perry said the heir's name the way boys say the names of people they will never meet. He said, Lady Odile Rennard herself. Imagine. I was pressing a pillow slip. I did not stop pressing it. I have learned from a master how to keep a face flat while something ends inside it. I said, how nice, Perry. And I counted the pillow slip's hem, and the number came out wrong, and I pressed it again. Do you see the shape of it? He was bringing her here. Corwin Rennard, who had removed me from the valley 3 years before so cleanly, was going to set his careful arithmetic down in my orchard, on my grass, under my trees, and stand his niece at an altar not 200 yards from the cottage where her daughter sleeps. He did not know that, of course. To him, this valley was a pretty neutral field, with no variables left in it. He had counted me out years ago. He did not know that one of his removed variables had walked back in and asked for the cider house at the dark edge, and had a green-eyed reason to keep it dark. I stood at the still room window a long time after Perry ran off, and I did the only arithmetic that mattered now. How many days, how many strangers, How many chances for one loud small girl to be seen? The wedding was in 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to keep my daughter invisible in her own home. I should tell you about Lady Coralie Voss, because she is not the villain of this, and it would be easy to let you think she was. She came to Orchard Hall a week before the wedding to see the ground, as brides do, and I pressed her linen, because pressing linen is what I am. And so I saw her close. She was perhaps 34, pale gold and poised, with the particular tiredness of a woman being married for a coastline. She was kind to the staff, which not all of them are. She thanked me for the linen by name, having troubled to learn it. And once, standing at the window of the room we had given her, looking down the orchard at the aisle they were building between the trees, she said to me, not really to me, more to the glass, "Do you think a person can be a good wife to someone whose whole heart went somewhere else years ago and never quite came back?" I said I did not know, my lady. She said no, neither do I. And she pressed her palm flat to the cold glass, and I understood that Corwin Rennard had done his arithmetic on her too. There were a great many of us in his sums. So began the 3 weeks I still count, stitch by stitch. I made rules. Elsie did not come into the main orchard while there were strangers in it, which meant by day she did not leave the cider house and its little walled garden at all, a cruel thing to ask of a loud 2-year-old who loves the sky, and which I softened with every small trick a mother learns, a game of the quiet, a nest of blankets by the low window, the promise of the pear tree at dusk when the workers had gone. Perry, who is kind and cannot hold news but can, it turns out, hold a kindness, took to bringing me things at the cottage without ever once asking why the linen keeper kept a child at the dark edge of the orchard. I think he decided it was not his to ask. I have been carried in my life by the people who decided a thing was not theirs to ask. Mrs. Enderby taught them all that, I think, without a word. It is the house's real religion. Odile came on the Thursday, 4 days before. I did not see the carriage. I heard the house change. A great house arriving is a kind of weather. The staff stood straighter. The yard went quiet. Mrs. Enderby's keys stopped jingling because she had stilled her own hands, and I stood in the still room with a half-pressed sheet and felt 3 years fold up like a fan and become no time at all. I did not go to the window. I want that on the record too. I did not go to the window because I am careful, and because if I saw her, I did not trust the flat face to hold, and the flat face was the only wall standing between Corwin Rennard and my daughter. So I pressed the sheet. I counted its hem, and I heard, through the open still room door, across the courtyard, a voice I had spent 3 years unlearning say 2 quiet words to a groom about a horse. Just, "Thank you, Bram." And my hands stopped, and the counting stopped, and I stood in a room full of clean linen and could not for the life of me have told you the number I was on. I saw her the next morning, from far off, which is the only way I let myself see her that whole first week. She was walking the Espalier walk alone at dawn. Of course she was. It was the one place she had ever been allowed to simply stand. And I was carrying pressed linen up from the cottage along the high path, and I stopped behind the wall, and I watched her stand under the flat pear tree, the way she used to stand under it, one hand up to a pinned branch, her dark head bare. And I catalogued her the way I cannot help but catalogue her, the low knot of chestnut hair, the economy of the way she held still, the 2 fingers going up even now, even alone, to the inside of her own wrist, deciding whether to say a true thing. To no one. At dawn, under our tree. I did not go down. Elsie was asleep in the cottage 40 yards below her other mother, and I did not go down. I stood behind a wall and counted the stones in it until she left. There is a thing I have not told you, because it is the hardest to say plainly without sounding like the old stories, and I have spent this whole telling trying not to sound like the stories. But it is true so. An alpha and an omega who were once bonded do not fully unbond by being lied to. 3 years and 2 valleys had worn it down to almost nothing. A thread. The rumor of a thread. But standing that close to her, even behind a wall, even downwind, I felt it pull, low and old. The way you feel a change in the weather in a bone you once broke. Cold pear and cedar. Her scent on the dawn air across a walled garden. And if I could feel it, worn as it was, then she could feel it too. And better because she is the stronger of us. And always was. I understood standing behind that wall that I did not have only 3 weeks to hide a green-eyed girl. I had 3 weeks to hide from a woman whose blood would tell her, a little more each day, that something she had buried was breathing again somewhere near the pear tree. On the second day, she asked about the cottage. I did not hear it happen. Mrs. Enderby told me that evening in the linen room, in the flat, careful way she saves for things she has decided I need to know, and no one else. Odile had been walking the high path and had stopped, apparently, and looked a long time down at the cider house at the dark edge, and had asked, in that quiet voice, who lived there now, because she remembered it standing empty. Mrs. Enderby had said, "One of the staff, my lady," and left it there, an old woman being vague about a servant, which no great lady questions. But she told me because she wanted me to know the wall had a crack in it. She said, "She looks at that cottage the way a dog looks at a door it has decided has something behind it." "Be careful, Saskia," I said. I was always careful. She said, "I know, that is what worries me." We almost met on the third day, in the low corridor between the still room and the great hall, where the linen presses are. I had my arms full of pressed tablecloths for the wedding breakfast, my chin holding the top of the stack, and I came around the press and she was there, 6 feet away, stopped, having come the other way for reasons I will never know. For one whole second, we were 2 women in a narrow corridor with 3 years and a lie and a green-eyed child between us. And she looked at me, and I looked at the tablecloths, and I made my face the flat wall and said, "My lady," and stepped back against the press to let her by, the way a linen keeper steps back for the air of a shipping house. She did not step by. She stood there. And then she said, in the voice, very quietly, "Saskia." I had prepared for a great many things in 3 years. I had not prepared for the sound of my own name in her mouth in a linen corridor, and I nearly dropped the tablecloths and did not, because I am careful even when I am dying. I said, "My lady." She said, "You came back." Not a question. I said the still room was empty. She said, "I heard you had gone to a city." I said, "It did not suit me." 4 words. I have replayed them 1,000 times, those 4 small, careful words, because they were true and a lie at once. The city had not suited me because there had never been a city. But I could not say that, so I said a true thing shaped like the false one, which is the only kind of sentence I have said to her in 3 years. She looked at me a long moment. 2 fingers went to the inside of her wrist, and she decided again to believe me and stepped by. And I let her. I got the tablecloths to the great hall. I set them on the long table, and I smoothed the top one flat with both hands, the way you smooth a bed you will not sleep in. And I stood there and counted the creases in it. 1, 2, 3. And my eyes were doing a thing that eyes do, and I made them stop, because there were footmen in the room, and a linen keeper does not weep over a tablecloth. Mrs. Enderby found me there. She did not say anything for a while. She smoothed the cloth from the other side, matching my hands, an old woman and a young one ironing nothing with their palms. Then she said, "He is not going to win this the way he thinks." I said, "Who?" She said, "You know who." I said, "He already won 3 years ago." She said, "No, he made a bargain 3 years ago. Bargains come due." And she went to see about the flowers and left me with that, which is the way she says the largest things, sideways. And then she goes to see about the flowers. The first true danger came on the 4th day, and it was my own fault, because I had been careful about the wrong thing. I had watched the orchard and the paths and the strangers, and I had not watched the one window of the great hall that looks, if you stand at the far left of it, straight down the slope to the cider house. Elsie had been at the cottage window. She is too. And windows are the sky when you are not allowed the sky. And she had seen, far off, the workers and the white chairs and the bright strange bustle, and done what any child does at a window, which is press her hands to it and stare. And Odile, crossing the great hall, had stopped at that far left pane. Mrs. Enderby saw her stop. She saw her go very still, looking down the slope, and she walked over, keys jingling on purpose now, and said, "My lady, the flowers are asking for you," and drew her away by the simple violence of being an old woman who will be answered. But she told me. She said she saw movement at the cottage window. Not what. But she stood at that glass like a woman who has heard a sound in an empty house. "Keep her back from the window, Saskia." And I went cold all the way down. That night, I hung a gray blanket over the low cottage window, the one that faces the house, and I told Elsie it was to keep the moon out, and she told me she liked the moon, and I said I knew, and I hung it anyway, and hated myself in the ordinary quiet way I have learned to hate myself while doing the necessary thing. Later, I made her warm milk in the chipped cream cup, the one she has claimed as hers because the chip on its rim is shaped, she insists, like a little bird, and she drank it cross about the moon and fell asleep. I sat by the covered window, with the unfinished christening gown in my lap and did not sew it, and I did the arithmetic of the next 3 days over and over. The breakfast, the rehearsal, the wedding, and then the great house would fold up its weather and go north and take its air and its cold pear scent away, and the crack in the wall would close, and Elsie could have the moon back. 3 days. I could hold a perimeter for 3 days. I had held one for 3 years. The rehearsal was the next afternoon, in the orchard, at the half-built altar. I was not meant to be near it, but the wedding breakfast linen had to be aired on the High Line, which happens to overlook the aisle. And I am nothing if not a woman who can find a legitimate reason to be exactly where her heart has already gone. So I pinned sheets to the line and watched, through the gaps between them, my whole ruined life rehearse itself. Odile stood where she would stand. Coralie stood where she would stand. Corwin stood a little apart, hands behind his back conducting. And at one point the officiant asked Odile some small question about where she would place her hand. And Odile, who was tired, I think, and holding very still, the way she holds still when a thing costs her, lifted her hand and did not press her wrist. She tugged her own earlobe, thumb and finger quick to the ear, and 40 yards away, behind a hanging sheet, I stopped breathing, because I have watched my daughter make that exact small motion 1,000 times, and I had told myself it came from me. And it does not come from me. I want to be precise about what that did to me, because it is the hinge of everything. For 2 years, I had let myself believe the earlobe was a small mystery of my daughter's, a thing children simply do. It was easier to believe, because the other belief, that she had it from her other mother, in the blood, a gesture pressed into her before she was born, made the hiding unbearable in a new way. It meant the resemblance was not only in the green of her eyes, which I could pretend was chance. It was in her hands, in the small nervous grammar of her. My daughter is written in Odile's hand as surely as if she had signed her. And if I could see it from 40 yards through a sheet, then anyone who knew them both could see it. And there is exactly one person in the world who knows them both. Me. Which meant the danger was never that a stranger would notice. The danger was that the mother at the altar would ever, once, stand close enough to the girl at the window to notice herself. That evening, Mrs. Enderby said the largest thing she has ever said to me. And she said it, of course, sideways, while counting napkins. She said, "You should know she asked me about you." I kept my face on the napkins. I said, "What about me?" She said, "Whether you were happy, whether the city had been good to you, whether you had married." I said nothing. She said, "I told her I did not know your business," which was a lie, and I do not lie easily, so you will understand I did it for a reason. Then she set the napkins down and looked at me with her clear old eyes and said the thing. She said, "That woman has never once in 3 years believed you left because you were tired of her. She has made herself believe it because the other shape is worse. But she does not believe it. A woman who believed it would not stand under your pear tree at dawn pressing her wrist. Whatever you did, Saskia, and I have never asked what you did. You did not manage to make her stop. I went back to the cottage and took the christening gown out of its blue paper and decided, for the length of about an hour, that I would finish it. I do not fully know why. Something about the word believed. I threaded the needle and lifted the shoulder seam and set the first stitch, and the second, and I got 4 stitches into the seam I have not been able to close in 2 years, 4, before my hands remembered what my head had briefly forgotten, which is that a christening is a name said aloud in front of people, and my daughter's name cannot be said aloud in front of people because the wrong person is sleeping 200 yards away under the same blossom. So I stopped at 4 stitches. But I wanted on the record that for the first time in 2 years the counting held long enough for 4. Something had shifted. I did not yet know it was the whole world beginning to shift. I thought it was only my hands. The day before the wedding, I handed her a thing, and our hands did not touch. And I have thought about the not touching more than about most things that did happen. She had come to the still room herself, sent, I think, by Coralie, about a veil that needed pressing, a small errand a great lady does herself only when she wants a reason to be somewhere. I pressed the veil. I folded it. I held it out to her across the work table, both my hands flat under the tool, and she took it, and she was careful. She took the veil, and not my hands, a clean half-inch of considered air between her fingers and mine. And I understood that she was holding a perimeter too. She thought I had left her. She would not reach across half an inch to a woman who had chosen to go. She is proud, and she is kind, and those 2 things had built her the same wall grief had built me. We stood there a moment, 2 women holding half an inch of air apart on purpose, and then she said, "Thank you," and took her veil, and went, and I stood in the linen room and shook. That night Elsie asked me about the lady in green, and my stomach went to water. I had covered the window, but not the one gap where the blanket does not quite meet the frame, and she is small enough to find any gap, and she had watched, apparently. That afternoon, a tall lady in dark green walked the high path alone. She said, "The sad lady." She said, "Why is she sad, Mama?" And I knelt down and did the thing I have done her whole small life, which is tell her a true thing shaped simple enough to be safe. I said, "She lost something a long time ago, and she has not found it." Elsie thought about this with her whole serious face. Then she tugged her earlobe and said, "We could help her find it." And I said, "Go to sleep, my love," and turned my face away so she would not see it. And I sat in the dark of the cottage a long time, because my 2.5-year-old daughter had just offered, tugging the ear she got from a woman she has never met, to help that woman find the thing she lost. And the thing she lost was in the room, offering to help. The evening before the wedding, I broke my own rule, and I have never decided whether it was weakness or whether some part of me, wiser than my arithmetic, knew what was coming and wanted to give my daughter one good thing first. The workers had gone, the orchard was empty and gold, and the aisle stood finished and white between the trees, 200 pale chairs waiting in the blossom. And I could not bear to keep Elsie behind a gray blanket on the last soft evening of her secret life. So I wrapped her in a shawl and took her, at dusk, when I was as sure as I could be that the great house was at its long dinner, down the far road to the flat pear tree, her tree, at the very end of the espalier walk, away from the aisle, screened by the wall. And she ran the last of it, loud and delighted, and stood under the pinned branches, and I let her have the sky for 1 hour. It was the last hour of the life I had built. I did not know that. I am glad now that I did not know it, because I would have held it too tight to enjoy. There was a thing I had to solve for the wedding day itself, and I solved it badly. And the bad solution is the whole reason my daughter walked down an aisle. On the day, I could not both keep Elsie and do my work. A wedding is the linen keeper's high holy day. I would be needed at the breakfast, at the changing rooms, at 100 small cloth emergencies from dawn until the vows. And I could not carry a 2-year-old through the great hall on the one morning the whole world was looking at it. So I asked Perry. I trusted Perry, and I still do. None of this is Perry's fault. I asked him to sit with Elsie in the cottage through the ceremony, to keep her happy and quiet and away from the window, and to not let go of her hand if for any reason they came outside. He swore it with his whole earnest 19-year-old heart, and he meant it. But Perry is 19 and Elsie is quick, and a bright loud morning is a great deal to ask of both of them. I knew the risk. I counted it against the risk of carrying her through the house myself, and the arithmetic said Perry. I have redone that sum 10,000 times. It always comes out Perry. That is the thing about the worst days. The arithmetic is right and it still goes wrong. The morning of the wedding came up clear and warm and merciless. The kind of blossom morning that does not care what it is the backdrop for. I was up before the birds. I pressed and I carried. I mended a torn hem on a bridesmaid's sleeve and steamed the creases out of 200 napkins. And I did it all with the flat face, the good wall, while somewhere at the dark edge of the orchard, Perry let himself into the cider house with a bag of small wooden animals to keep a girl entertained. The great house woke and dressed and became, room by room, a wedding. I did not let myself go near the orchard where the aisle was. I kept to the house and to the linen. I told myself that if I simply did not look at it, if I held the perimeter one more day, by evening, the barges would be loading, and the cold pear scent would be going north, and my daughter and I would be safe again in our small whitewashed world, cross about the moon. I almost made it. I want you to know that. I almost held it all the way to the vows. By noon, the guests were arriving, and I finally had to be near it, because the breakfast linen was laid in the long tent at the head of the aisle, and someone had to keep it. So I stood at the very edge of the crowd, at the mouth of the tent, in my gray apron, invisible in the way servants are invisible, and I watched 200 fine strangers settle into the pale chairs between the flowering trees. I could see the whole aisle from there. I could see the little stone chapel steps where the altar stood, dressed in white and green. I could see House Rennard take his place at the front, in a forest green coat with iron buttons, hands behind his back, a man watching a sum come out. And I told myself, 1 more hour. Keep your eyes on the linen. Do not look for her. I looked for her. Of course I looked for her. A woman cannot spend 3 years unlearning a face and then not look when it is about to belong to someone else. Then the music changed, and she came. Odile walked the aisle alone. No one gives away the heir of House Rennard. She gives away herself, in dark green, because she would not wear white for a marriage she had not chosen, and even I, who was breaking, could see it was the only defiance her uncle had left her. She walked the way she does everything, unhurried, her chin level, 200 faces turned to her, and she reached the altar and turned and stood beside Coralie, who was lovely and pale gold and grave in her dove-gray gown, and the two of them stood there, 2 women being married to a coastline, and neither of them looked happy, and both of them looked kind, and it was, I thought, the saddest, well-mannered thing I had ever seen. The officiant began. Corwin's hands behind his back went still, and down at the dark edge of the orchard, though I did not know it yet, a 19-year-old boy had just turned to reach for a bag of wooden animals, and a quick green-eyed girl had seen a gap in a garden gate. I felt her before I saw her. That is the truth. And it is the part that undoes me still. Halfway through the officiant's slow words, I felt the thread pull. The worn, old thread, cold pear and cedar, but doubled now. Wrong, too strong, coming from the wrong direction, from down the aisle rather than up at the altar. And my whole body knew before my eyes did, the way your hand knows the stove before the pain arrives. I turned. And there, at the far end of the long white aisle, having come up through the orchard rows on her own small determined legs, out of the trees and onto the gravel, was my daughter, in her cream smock, with blossom in her hair, looking down 200 yards of aisle, at the woman in green at the altar, and she had gone very still, the way she goes still when she sees a thing she wants, and she had put her thumb and finger to her own ear. She began to walk. My daughter, who did not know the word wedding, who knew only that at the end of a long bright path there was a woman who had her eyes and looked sad and had lost something. She set off down the aisle to help her find it. She walked the way 2-year-olds walk, wobbling and certain, arms a little out for balance, blossom coming down, and one by one, the 200 fine strangers felt the wedding stop being about the altar. Heads turned. A murmur went down the rows like wind through trees. Whose child? How sweet. How strange. And I was already moving, pushing off the tent pole and starting down the edge of the crowd with my heart in my mouth and no plan on earth, only the single animal need to reach her before any of this could land on her small shoulders. But I was 200 yards back and to the side, behind a wall of seated people, and she was already a third of the way down, and the woman at the altar had begun, slowly, to turn. Odile turned last. She had been facing the officiant, holding still the way she holds still when a thing costs her. And the murmur reached her the way the last person in a room always hears the news, and she turned her head, and then her whole body, toward the far end of her own wedding aisle. And she saw a small girl in a cream smock walking toward her through the falling blossom. I watched it hit her. I am, God help me, an expert in the flat face of Odile Rennard, and I watched it fail for the first time completely. I watched her see the green of the eyes, which was her own green, the rare, deep, impossible green I had looked into 2 days after this child was born. And I watched her see the small hand come up, thumb and finger to the little ear, her gesture, the one thing her uncle had never managed to pin flat. And Odile Rennard, who never in my knowledge raised her voice, made a sound, small, broken, and went down onto one knee on the chapel step, not away from the child but toward her, holding out one hand. The officiant had stopped. Coralie had stepped back a pace, one hand to her mouth, her grave face full of a dawning, careful understanding, and into the enormous silence of 200 held breaths. Corwin Renner did the thing he does, which is try to close the drawer. He said, quietly, to a footman, "Take the child inside. A servant's child has wandered. Take it back." Courteous, reasonable, already rewriting it into a small mishap. And Odile, without standing, without raising her voice, said the 2 words. She said them to the footman, to her uncle, to the whole orchard. To me 200 yards back and running, she said, "Not without you." And it took me a moment, running, to understand that she was not talking to me at all yet. She was talking to the child on the gravel with her eyes. She was saying, "Whatever this is, whatever it costs, you are not going anywhere without me." And then she looked up and down the aisle and found me at last, coming through the crowd with my apron and my flat face wholly broken. And she said it again, and this time it was mine, "Not without you." Elsie reached her. My brave, loud, ordinary daughter walked the last of the aisle and stopped in front of the kneeling woman in green and looked at her with frank 2-year-old interest and said, "I heard it. The whole orchard heard it. It will be told at that house for 100 years. She said, "Did you find it yet?" Meaning the lost thing. Meaning the thing the sad lady had been looking for. And Odile made the broken sound again, and did not grab her, did not clutch, was careful even then, even wrecked. She held out both hands and waited, the way you wait for a bird, and let Elsie decide. And Elsie, who likes people who wait, stepped into her hands. Odile gathered her up off the gravel and stood, and held her, my whole hidden world in a green sleeve, and pressed her face for 1 second into the light brown curls. And I stopped a few feet away because I could not make my legs go the last of it. And she looked at me over the top of our daughter's head with 3 years of everything in her face. And Corwin Rennard began too late to understand what some had just come due. He recovered fast. I will give him that. A man does not rule a house for 40 years without the ability to keep talking while the ground moves. He came down from the front, unhurried, and said, in the closing drawer voice, loud enough for the rows, that this was a distressing scene and a transparent one. A former servant, dismissed years ago for cause, who had taken money and gone, now returned to press a base-born child upon a great house on its wedding day for a settlement. He said the word base-born gently, which is the cruelest way to say it. He said, everyone can see the poor girl has coached the child. He said, "Odile, put it down. This is exactly the kind of grasping I protected you from." And I felt the whole orchard tilt toward believing him, because he was a lord in a green coat, and I was a linen keeper in a gray apron. And his was the sort of voice that sounds like the truth to a crowd, and mine was the sort that shakes. And I understood that I had about 10 seconds to decide whether to keep the flat face and let him win, or open my mouth in front of 200 strangers and finally, 3 years too late, tell the truth out loud. So I told it. I have never in my life spoken to more than one person at a time if I could help it, and I stood in a wedding aisle and told 200 of them the truth, and my voice shook the whole way through, and I did not stop. I said my name. I said I had been the linen keeper here, and that 3 years ago Lord Corwin Rennard had come to my still room and told me to end it and go, and given me silver to be seen taking so the leaving would look like greed, and threatened the Aldemar's trade and my mother's people's fields if I refused. I said I had never spent 1 coin of that silver, that it had gone entire to the cousins whose land he threatened, and any of them would say so. I said I had not known when I went that I was carrying her. I said her name, Elsie. I said she is 2.5, and she has never been coached to do anything in her life except sleep, at which she also fails. And a small real laugh went through the crowd, and I felt the scale settle back the other way, just slightly. And then Mrs. Enderby stepped out of the crowd, keys and all, 40 years of this house standing up in a gray dress, and said, in the voice that has never once been questioned in this valley, "Every word the girl has said is true, and I will swear it before anyone you like." And I have the letters he thought were burned. The letters undid him. I had not known Mrs. Enderby kept them. The instructions in his own hand to the steward about the settlement and the leaving and the trade he would break. A great house runs on paper, and a great housekeeper keeps the paper, and she had kept 40 years of the truth in a locked press because, she told me later, she does not throw away the things that might one day need saying. Corwin Rennard looked at the old woman who had folded his sheets since before Odile was born, and understood that the one variable he had never counted was the one who counts everything, and the closing drawer voice had, at last, nothing to close. And into that silence, Lady Coralie Voss did the finest thing I saw that day. She stepped forward and took Corwin's arm, not Odile's Corwin's, and said gently that she thought the wedding was concluded, and that she would not be marrying into a house that did this to its own, and that she wished the child every happiness, looking at Elsie as she said it. And then she walked her would-be uncle-in-law back up his own aisle, dignified and pale gold and free, and left the altar to the 3 of us it had always, secretly belonged to. They cleared the orchard the way crowds clear from a thing they will talk about forever, slowly, backward, unwilling to stop watching. Perry appeared from somewhere, scarlet with shame and relief, and Odile, who had not put our daughter down, crouched and let Elsie choose again, and Elsie, who had had an enormous morning, chose Perry and a promised biscuit and went, tugging her ear and waving at the sad lady, who was not sad now, or was sad in a different direction. And then it was the 2 of us, at the foot of a chapel step, dressed for a wedding that would not happen, in a snow of blossom, 3 years and 100 feet and a lie apart. And neither of us moved to close it. She stood there in her dark green with our daughter's warmth still on her shoulder, and she looked at me, and she did not reach for me. I understood why. I had built her a wall out of a lie, and she was too proud and too kind and too freshly wounded to climb a wall a woman might have meant. She said quietly, "I need to hear it from you. Not from letters. Not from an old woman with a press full of proof. From you. Did you want to go?" I said no. I said it plainly, the way she taught me to say true things, no soft edges on it. I said I never wanted to go. I wanted to grow old under that pear tree with you and be buried under it. He gave me a sum I could not win, and I chose the answer that hurt you cleanest. And I have been sorry every single day, and I would do it again. Because the fields are still my cousin's fields, and the trade is still the Aldemar's trade. And you were, for 3 years, safe from a war you would have lost. There was never a city, There was never anyone else. There was you, and then there was her. And I hid her because a hidden thing is a free thing. And Odile listened to all of it without moving. And when I finished, she pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, deciding at last whether to believe a true thing. And she said, "He told me the same shape. Backward. He told me you had come to him, that you were tired of a barge that only came when a house could spare it and had named a price. I believed it 3 years because the alternative was that I had let them take you and had not fought. We were lied to in a mirror, you and I. He gave us each the other's worst face and let us live inside it." We stood a moment with that between us. 3 years, mirrored, gone. She was the first to speak. She said, "I am not going to reach for you." And my heart, which had been rising, stopped. And she said, pressing her wrist, saying the truest thing she has ever said to me, "Because I spent 3 years believing you chose to leave. And I built a whole life around not reaching for a woman who chose to leave. And I will not now reach across and take you the way my uncle takes things. Because he wanted, or because there is a child, or because the crowd would understand it. A claim you make to keep someone is only a cage with a kinder name. I have been kept my whole life. I will not keep you. If you are going to come back to me, Saskia, you will have to cross the ground yourself, freely, knowing you can turn around. And I am going to stand here and let you choose, even though standing here and not reaching for you is the hardest thing I have ever made my body do." So I crossed the ground. I want to be careful telling you this, because it is the whole point, and the point is that no one made me. Not the crowd, not the child, not 3 years, not the blood. I looked at a woman standing very still in the wreck of someone else's wedding, holding her own hands away from me on purpose, so that whatever I did next would be mine. And I took my mother's needle case and her iron ring off the cord at my throat, both of them, the 2 weights I had carried 3 years, and closed them in my fist, and walked the 100 feet of blossom-covered grass, and did not stop, and lifted my hand and put it flat against the pale scar through her eyebrow, and then along her jaw. She turned her face into my palm and closed her eyes, and neither of us said anything for a long moment, because there was nothing left to make straight. Then I put my forehead against hers, the way you do when standing up is suddenly too much, and you need another skull to hold your own up. And I felt her hands come up at last and settle, careful, at the small of my back, asking, not taking. And I said the only 2 words that fit. I said, "Not without you." I opened my fist between us and showed her what I had carried. The pearwood needle case, my mother's, and the iron ring, her iron ring, the ugly working band she had put in my hand under the pear tree and told me to keep something with a weight. She looked at it a long time. She said, "I told my uncle you had thrown it in the river." I said, "I told him the same." And we both, absurdly, at the foot of a ruined wedding, laughed. The small wrecked laugh of 2 people who have just learned they told the same lie to the same man to keep the same small iron thing. She took the ring from my palm. She did not put it on her own hand. She took my hand and she put it back on my finger, where I think she had meant it to go 3 years ago, and had not had the courage, and closed my fingers over it the way she had the first time and said, "It was never not a promise." I only did not have the nerve to say the word. I am saying it now. And I said, "Say it then." And she pressed her wrist and did not need to, and said it. She said, "Marry me. Not for a house. There is no house anymore, I expect, after today. Marry me because I have loved you since you told me to move my elbow off the good linen, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being told to move my elbow." And I said yes. I said okay. She said okay. We went and got our daughter from Perry, who had given her not 1 biscuit but 3, and who will therefore be beloved by Elsie until the end of time. Odile knelt down to her. She is always kneeling to her. She spent 37 years being pinned upright, and has decided our daughter is the one thing she will always get down on the ground for. And Elsie looked at her with the frank green consideration she gives everything and tugged her ear. And Odile, who I did not know had ever noticed the gesture in herself, tugged her own ear back, Exactly, thumb and finger, the two of them mirrored in the blossom. And Elsie laughed the enormous laugh she is allowed to laugh now. Everywhere. In the sky. Forever. And then my daughter, who does not forget a task, put her small hand on the sad lady's wet face and asked the question again. She said, "Did you find it yet?" And Odile said, in the quiet exact voice, the truest thing. She said, "Yes, I found it. I found both of you, not without you." And I stood over the two of them in the falling blossom and understood that the sum had, after everything, come out. I will give you the parts that are just happiness quickly, as promised. Corwin Rennard went north that same week, and the shipping alliance went with him. And the house lost the coast road it had sold 3 lives to buy. And I have found, to my own surprise, that I do not gloat, because a man who espaliers children into walls was himself espaliered once by someone. And there is no bottom to that particular sorrow, only the choice to stop passing it down. Odile chose to stop. The first thing she did, when the lawyers had finished, was write to every tenant her uncle had ever threatened, my mother's cousins first, and put their leases in their own names, unbreakable, forever, so that no future lord could make a linen keeper choose between the woman she loved and the fields her people farmed. She said it was the only thing she wanted the house's money for. She said, "I would like to spend what is left of it making sure no one ever has to do the arithmetic you did." And I loved her so much in that moment, I had to go and press something. Elsie has the sky now. That is the thing I think about most. Of all the things that changed, the gray blanket came down off the cottage window the day after the wedding, that wasn't, and went into the rag bag where it belonged. And my daughter, who spent the first 2.5 years of her life being quiet, being hidden, being kept small so that she could be kept free, was told she never had to be quiet again. And she has taken the news exactly as loudly as you would hope. She runs the whole orchard. She knows every hand by name. She has 3 mothers' worth of attention now, mine and Odile's and Mrs. Enderby's, who denies being a third mother and is a third mother. And she is, everyone tells me, the loudest, greenest-eyed, most spoiled, and least ruined child in the valley. We moved into the hall in the end, though I kept the cider house, because a person should keep the room where she learned to survive. I go there sometimes and sit and do not count anything. It is very restful to be a woman with nothing left to make straight. We were married under the flat pear tree, of course. Where else? Not 200 chairs, 11 people, and a housekeeper who cried and denied crying, and an orchard hand who is now, by Elsie's decree, family, and my mother's cousins down from 2 valleys over with their fields safe and their own names on them. And I finished the christening gown. I want you to know that specifically because I told you at the start that I was a woman who could not close one seam. And I am telling you now, at the end, that I sat down the evening before the wedding with the little white gown across my lap and threaded the needle and lifted the shoulder. And my hands did not shake. And I closed the seam in 11 stitches. And I counted every one of them, and every one of them was straight. Odile watched me do it. She did not say anything. She pressed her wrist once and decided not to say the true thing, because some true things are better watched than said, and she has learned the difference. That is nearly the whole of it. And I have told it to you the way Elsie likes her own stories told, slowly, with all the frightening parts, and a good ending kept for last. If you want the parts I could not put here, the long uncut version of what those 3 years did to us, and the first night after the orchard, and everything the flat face was hiding all that time, the full uncut chapter is waiting on my Patreon. The link is in the description. Tell me where you are watching from, and then stay, because there is a little more, and the little more is the best of it. Elsie was christened in the little stone chapel with the rose window, in a gown finished at last, and her name was said aloud, in front of people, which is the whole of what a christening is, and the one thing I had never been able to give her. She tugged her ear through all of it. Odile tugged hers back. Mrs. Enderby held the letters, the proof of the lie, and afterward, in the orchard, without a word, she gave them to Odile, and Odile gave them to me, and we burned them in the cottage hearth that night, the two of us, feeding 3 years of a cold man's arithmetic into a fire that draws if you know its temper. We did not say anything either. There was nothing left in them worth a word. She still drinks from the chipped cream cup with the bird on it. Odile still presses her wrist before she says a true thing, though I have started to notice she does it less, because she has fewer true things left that she is afraid to say. My mother's needle case and the iron ring live on the same cord at my throat still. Only now the ring has been on my finger and back, and means the thing it always meant. And on the nights our daughter fights sleep, cross about the moon she is now allowed to love as loudly as she likes, one of us lies down on either side of her in the dark, and she reaches out both her hands to be sure we are both still there. We always are. I spent 3 years being a woman who could keep her daughter or keep her love, but never both. Holding a perimeter alone in the dark, I do not hold it alone anymore. That is the whole of it. A careful linen keeper counted the cost of everything, once, and got the sum wrong in the only direction that ever mattered. She thought she had to choose. She did not have to choose. It only took a lie, and 3 years, and a 2-year-old who does not know the word wedding walking down 200 yards of aisle to tell a sad lady she could help her find the thing she lost. The sad lady found it. She found both of us. And on the nights the moon is bright, and my daughter's small hand reaches out in the dark and finds 2 mothers instead of one, I hear still the 2 words that ended one life and started the right one, said under a pear tree by a woman who will not take what she can be freely given. Not without you, not without you, not without you.